I cannot help where I was born, and I'm not ashamed of my birthplace, but I do claim that I have done my best to make Cleethorpes known to the outside world, and its deliberations in council respected. Yes, I said that 25 years ago, and it's as true today as it was then. I was born in Cleethorpes. I have lived here all my life. It is my home, and a place that I love, and I dare say I will die here. Hopefully, in my own bed, having smoked a damn fine cigar. Well, I was born in Cleethorpes on the 28th of November 1859, the son of Walker Moody and Catherine Bancroft. To give me my full name, I am George Edward James Moody. I'm not sure why I have so many Christian names. Perhaps my parents were using up all the boys' names they liked in case they never had another son, which they didn't. My parents married in Gayton-le-Wold in 1844, I believe. At that time, my father was an agricultural labourer near Louth, but in the late 1840s they came to Cleethorpes. I think perhaps they honeymooned it here and I liked what they saw. Of course, it was just a tiny fishing village back then, trying to be a Bath-on-Sea for well-to-do visitors. My father Walker was a remarkable man. Although he could barely read or write and came to Cleethorpes with very little to his name, he was a true entrepreneur, and quite rightly regarded as one of the fathers of the local fishing industry. He saw the potential in Cleethorpes, but in the early years here he had to do whatever he could to raise capital and support a growing family. He was a huckster, a fisherman, a carter, and an oyster dealer, and there were few brushes with the law as it went about his business. My father told me once about a court case that happened a few years before I was born, when he was still a fisherman. A fishmonger from Sheffield brought a case against him for non-delivery of oysters. The man had sent a money order, but because my father did not have the goods to supply him with, he sent the money back and considered the end of the matter. This man then had the damned cheek to try and sue my father for the alleged losses he had sustained in not receiving the oysters, as well as for the cost of the lawyer's letters. Then to cap it all, the fool insisted on travelling 70 miles on foot from Sheffield to Grimsby and expected to be paid 6pence a mile, as well as for the loss of the 3 days he had been occupied in travelling. I am happy to report that he was sent away with a flea in his ear, and hopefully a great many blisters on his feet. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. Those early years were hard. My parents and 4 older sisters survived the terrible cholera outbreak in 1854. But some of their near neighbours in Highthorpe were not so fortunate. Many people who remember Levi Stevenson in later life think of him merely as an eccentric man with a large nose who took visitors for a sail in his boat, the Cambridge Lass. But he lost his wife and 2 daughters in that cholera. Poor fellow. I believe he had to bury them in Old Clee himself. The final death toll was around 60, and it was a terrifying ordeal for all concerned. But I like to think that Cleethorpes learns by its mistakes, and a great deal was learned from that tragedy. Cleethorpes became a much more sanitary place, although it was still far from perfect. Fortunately, the visitors had short memories and came back in increasingly large numbers, particularly after the railway reached Cleethorpes in 1863. By then, I had been born, but my father had a very long wait for a son and heir. For the first 13 years of the marriage, he was surrounded by the fairer sex, and after 5 daughters, I suspect he'd begun to despair of ever having a male heir. Then finally, in 1858, my brother Fred came along, followed by me a year later. The final count was 7 daughters: Sarah Jane, Annie Elizabeth, Ellen, Emma, Fanny, Alice and Clara, and 2 sons, although sadly Sarah Jane died the year after I was born. so I never knew her. Nevertheless, the Moody men were always hopelessly outnumbered in the household. My father went from catching fish to selling it, and his success as a fish merchant meant that the family was able to move from Cambridge Street to a much-needed larger home, Clifton House, in what was then Albert Street. I had a wonderful childhood. They were exciting times. Cleethorpes was changing all the time before my very impressionable eyes. I watched St. Peter's Church being built before it opened in 1866. New houses were springing up all over the place, and when I was 13 they opened the first pier. It was 1,200 feet long and really rather beautiful. Someone described it at the time as having an unusually light and graceful appearance, which was probably why they had to strengthen it with steel girders a quarter of a century later. The current pier may look less graceful, but at least it's still standing. Like the town, my father's business interests also continued to grow, and he became a fishing smack owner. And I remembered when I was about 7, he had one built by Mr. Keatley, and they launched it from the Royal Dockyard before having a celebratory supper at the Dolphin in the evening. Of course, there was no toast, well, not with alcohol at any rate. My father and his friends were primitive Methodists and believed in total abstinence. Then, when I was 8, I took part in the Great Grimsby Regatta. Well, strictly speaking, it was my father's smack, the George Moody, but can you imagine my excitement at it being named after me? Fred had one named after him too, but mine was the one that took part in the first-class fishing smack race. The course was down the Humber, past the new sand lightship, round the number 1 buoy, then to the southward and eastward of the new sand light vessel, and up to the flagship, which was the dock company's steam tug, the Royal Albion. It was a beautiful sight, those smacks racing each other, and even though we finished 4th and missed out on the prize money, it was a wonderful day. I named an open boat, the Kitty, after my first child, and beat off the competition to win my race in the Cleethorpes Regatta. Having only been born the previous year, my daughter was sadly too young to appreciate the honour of having a boat named after her, but I told her about our collective triumph when she was. I also named one of our trawlers after my other daughter, Gladys, but that story did not have a happy ending. She was captured and sunk by a submarine in 1917. The year after the Grimsby Regatta, they launched the Cleethorpes lifeboat, the Manchester Unity. There were 50,000 people there on the cliffs and sands to see it, with bands playing and a procession through the streets. Of course, the lifeboat was later removed from Cleethorpes and taken to Grimsby. But, unlike our tussles with our neighbours over incorporation, that was less to do with them coveting our property and more to do with horses being drowned during the launching of the lifeboat. Speaking of horses, and do pardon me for digressing again, but I've just remembered another story I must tell you. When I was about 6 years old, there was a very unfortunate incident with my father's horse and cart. He had left it outside the post office in Grimsby and gone off to conduct some business or other, when something frightened the horse, causing it to bolt off along the pavement towards the marketplace. The beast smashed into Mr. Gates' shop near the corn exchange and damaged several other premises, before the cart mercifully overturned and the horse fell against the Black Swan. I suppose it could have been much worse, though. It could have happened in Cleethorpes instead of Grimsby. It never occurred to me that I was too young to marry. I had found the woman I wanted to spend my life with, so we were married by Reverend Price Jones at Oakley Church on the 23rd of June 1879, when I was 19 years old. She was born in Copenhagen, and her full name was Olga Christophine Sass Kraus, but Olga Moody was much easier to say. Her father Johan came over to Grimsby from Denmark in the early 1870s and became a master in the merchant service, although within a few years of us marrying he gave up the sea and opened dining rooms in Cleethorpes Road. To begin with, we lived in St. Peter's Road, and our first 3 children started their lives in that house. Catherine was born in 1880, George the following year, and Gladys in 1885. After that we moved to 28 Albert Road, where our second son William was born in 1887. Of course, the Moody family home was just down the road, and my mother lived there until she died, having managed to outlive the late Queen by 3 years. I'm sure she would have been proud of that. By the time I married Olga, I had been a working man for several years. My father saw to it that his children received an education that he never had, and then Fred and I learned the fish business under his tutelage. Some have described me as a visionary, but if I am, it is because he was a visionary before me. I am the man I am today because of my father and his successes and his failures. Fortune favoured him for more than 30 years, but he earned the good fortune that took him from working on the land to becoming a fish merchant, a smack owner and a property owner. He saw opportunities and he took them, but he was also a man of principle, a good man, a public-spirited man. One Christmas Eve, a few years before he died, he let it be known that any widow over the age of 70 who came to his shop in Cleethorpes Road would receive £1/4 pound of tea. I think 118 ladies presented themselves at his premises that day. The newspaper reported that their combined age was more than 8,000 years. With Cleethorpes growing and becoming harder to govern, it was decided that a local government body with more authority was needed, and my father was one of the 12 elected members of the Cleethorpes and Thrunscoe Local Board when it was created in 1873. There was some disquiet at the time because 7 of the board were fish merchants from the Grimsby pontoon, but my father was like me. His business may have been in Grimsby, but his heart was in Cleethorpes, and he laboured tirelessly in the best interests of the township. Incidentally, the first chair of the local board was the man who married me to Olga, and of course I was elected to the local board myself in 1882. The same year Fred, my brother-in-law, Henry Kelly and I myself went into business together. Moody's and Kelly was the name of the company, but that wasn't the first partnership between the Moody's and Kellys. That occurred when I was 5 years old and my sister Annie Elizabeth married Henry. At the time, he was a fisherman, but like my father, he did well for himself and became a successful grocer and fish merchant. I suppose people considered Fred and I quite young to be going into business, but Henry, as his experience, tempered our youthful enthusiasm. We took over my father's fish merchant's business, an equal partnership between the 3 of us, painstakingly documented in a very long-winded contract. But it was agreed that Fred and Henry would initially be the managing directors while I assisted my father with his dealings until such a time as he retired from business. Unfortunately, that retirement came sooner than anticipated and was sadly enforced after his fishing smack business went south. To many of the men who had smacks under him couldn't pay him what they owed, and regrettably he found himself in the bankruptcy court. In 1887 he had debts of £25,000. It was a bad time from which he never recovered. My father died the following year after going to London for an operation. He had been in a great deal of pain for some time, but the operation killed rather than cured. My thoughts were very much on him a few months after his death, when Moody's and Kelly's launched its first steam fishing vessel, the Arctic, the first of many. He should have been there to see it. He deserved better. As I said, the Arctic was the first of many. After that there was the Baltic, the Celtic, the Doric, the Electric, the Frolic, the Gaelic, the Hellenic, and so on. I think we reached the letter R, Romantic, after a decade. There were other vessels besides our ABC fleet though. The Lark, for example. She was the first steam trawler to operate out of Fleetwood. Moody's and Kelly started the steam trawling industry at Fleetwood in October 1891. One vessel became a fleet of steam trawlers, and now Fleetwood is the main fishing port on the western seaboard. We were the first to recognise that Fleetwood was the gateway to the west, and that's something of which I'm immensely proud. Moody's and Kellys did well. It did incredibly well. So much that Henry and Annie were able to build a new home, the Knoll, on Alexandra Road. And I bought the Knoll house right across the road from them. It has been my home since 1898, and I cannot imagine living anywhere else. From here you can see Cleethorpes in all its glory. Sometimes I look out of my window on a glorious summer's day and it takes my breath away. Now I'm in my golden years, or my dotage, depending on who you speak to. I like to take a pre-lunch stroll across the road and join the members of the Cleethorpes Parliament. They're a group of local gentlemen of a similar age to myself who debate, often quite heatedly, the morning's news and topics of local significance at the top of the cliff steps. As my adversaries in the council chamber will attest, I've always enjoyed a good argument, although I'm told I've mellowed with my old age. But not too much, I hope. I've always protested, and still protest, that politics should play no part in municipal affairs. There's no room for them in our council chamber, and I shall always endeavour to keep them out of our deliberations. That has been my belief ever since I was elected to the local board 57 years ago, and it will remain my belief until the day I die. There's always been those who enter the public service for self-serving reasons, but I can say unreservedly that I've always acted in the best interests of Cleethorpes and its ratepayers. I chose to take office all those years ago because, like my father, I could see the huge potential in the township and that it could become a seaside resort of the first rank. It was never meant to be Bath-on-Sea. Now, there's nothing wrong with Bath. Indeed, I've been fortunate enough to be able to stay at the Grand Pump Room Hotel on a number of occasions over the years. But Bath is not a place for the masses. It has a degree of exclusivity. Cleethorpes, on the other hand, is for everyone, rich or poor. The sun, the sea, the sand, the fresh air, and it's priceless because it's free. Who needs a free holiday annual from the council when you've got me, eh? But, as I was saying, I could have remained on the outside, sending grumbling letters to the newspapers, telling the local board what they should be doing. But instead, I chose to work from the inside and to act rather than react. I have always been a man who prefers performances to promises and action to advertisement. I am very much my father's son in that respect. Why talk about doing something when you can be getting on doing it? Had we not acted as a local board and later as the Urban District Council, I shudder to think where we would be. Well, for a start, Seabank Road, or Kingsway as it is now known, would have fallen into the sea long ago, and what was left of Cleethorpes would now be a suburb of Grimsby. You know, a newspaper once dared to describe me as being born in a suburb of Grimsby. Now that did merit a grumbling letter to the editor. Going back to politics, I was asked several times to stand as a candidate for election as a Member of Parliament, and whilst I considered it, I had to decline the invitation. It would not have been right for me. In fact, I suspect it would have been a disaster. A man who detests politics and self-serving politicians in the Houses of Parliament, I think I would have choked on the air of hypocrisy within minutes. As I mentioned earlier, my father had a few run-ins with the law, and so have I over the years, both professionally and, on occasion, personally. However, in 1901, just before the old Queen died, I was appointed as a borough magistrate for the 100 of Bradley in Haverstow, and I've had the letters JP after my name ever since. My brother-in-law Henry was also a magistrate, and his son after him. I know I shouldn't say this as a JP, but sometimes the law really can be an ass. I've always considered justice to be far more important than upholding the letter of the law, but some of the cases that come before me, well, frankly, they're a waste of everybody's time. During the war, a very respectable young lady from Cleethorpes was dragged before the court for collecting without a sealed receptacle on Hospital Saturday Technically, she had committed an offence, but the regulations had only recently been changed. The change had not been broadcast and it wasn't her fault. She'd been asked to help. I made my feelings plain and I told the court that I thought the regulations were stupid. My wife and daughters used to collect on Hospital Saturday, and if they'd been brought before the magistrates for doing their civic duty, well, I would have directed far worse than the word stupid at the prosecution. I also remember a case back in the early 1920s of a Rotherham miner who was fined for cycling on a footpath at Laceby. Yes, technically he broke the law, but the reason he was on the path was because the road was in such a dangerous state that he couldn't ride on it. As far as I was concerned, the county council should have paid his fine. I have presided over many cases over the years. Offensive postcards, illegal tea sales after 8 p.m, children bitten by dogs. Oh, and of course there was the case with the fireworks. I must tell you about that one. A woman appeared before the bench charged with selling fireworks to a child under 13, and wishing to thoroughly assess the potential annoyance that that firework might cause to people, I naturally suggested that one should be let off. In hindsight, perhaps we should have let it off outside. The constable lit a flash bomb and threw it at the solicitor's table. It exploded very loudly and hurled itself in the direction of one of the solicitors, just missing his face. Depending on your opinion of the solicitor concerned, it was either a lucky escape or a bad miss. There's a lot to be said for living to a ripe old age as I have. I've seen Cleethorpes grow from a tiny fishing village of my childhood into a municipal borough, and yes, I'm egotistical enough to acknowledge that I have played my part in that transformation. I'm proud of the seawall scheme, the park, the technical schools, the playgrounds, the marine embankment, and the many other advances made during my time on the council. And of course, I'm especially proud of my part in the long battle fought and finally won 3 years ago against our neighbours, Grimsby, and their infernal incorporation schemes. The more Cleethorpes grew, the more they coveted it. But we defied them for more than 40 years and averted a disaster that would have seen us swallowed up by Grimsby. It would have set Cleethorpes back 20 years. I remember after we saw off one of their attacks in 1908, the Cleethorpes brass band drove round in a charabanc playing See the Conquering Hero Come before making their way to the Grimsby Town Hall and playing the Death March outside. Outstanding! We saw off many such attempts, and so naturally it was a proud day when the King, Edward VIII, granted the town municipal borough status. The borough has already outlasted the King by several years, and I can only pray that Cleethorpes always retain its independence. Of course, tomorrow will be the 3rd anniversary of Charter Day. What a day it was, and what a privilege to be chosen as Charter Mayor, with my daughter Gladys by my side as Charter Mayoress. Sadly, my wife Olga did not live to see the day, but I'm sure she was there in spirit, probably celebrating the fact that I could finally stop my railing against Grimsby and their covetous ways. It truly was a spectacle to behold. The red robes, the chain of office, the cocked hats, luncheon at the pier, followed later by the charter ball, guards of honour, bands playing, children singing Jerusalem, and the crowds. So many proud Meggies, many of them children, lining the streets, and there in Sydney Park to witness the ceremony. It was as though all 30,000 inhabitants of the town had come out to celebrate that day. There was so much noise, and I must have been the only one not contributing to it. As someone who has never been silent on the subject of incorporation, or indeed any other subject, I was finally lost for words that day, owing to the effects of a severe cold, and the town clerk had to read my speeches. I'm sure there were some who found a speechless George Moody highly amusing, but even though I didn't read out the speech myself, I can still remember some of my replies to Lord Heneage, who presented the charter to me. We have been justly proud of our town in the past, and we are prouder still today in the knowledge that His Majesty has seen fit to grant us charter. I hope that, as a result of His Lordship's visit, the inhabitants of Cleethorpes will be inspired to greater efforts, and that there will never be wanting proper persons to come forward to give wholehearted service for the benefit of the community. There, I finally said it myself, 3 years too late. All this talk of Cleethorpes and Meggies and bands playing reminds me of another story concerning my old friend Bertie Collinson, who, as you know, was for many, many years the musical director at the pier. He first came to Cleethorpes in a professional capacity for the visit of Prince Albert Victor in 1885, and he's still here today. After 21 years' service at the pier, it was my pleasure to award him with a gold watch, and during the speeches he made the point that he had been in Cleethorpes for so many years he presumed he could consider himself a Meggie. "Have you swum Conyers Brick Pond yet?" I asked him, to which he replied he had not. But so eager was he to qualify as a bona fide Meggie that the next morning he got up early, went to the pond and swam across it, when he proudly informed me of his feat a few days later, expecting a handshake of welcome into the Honorary Order of Meggies. What he got instead was a response of, "More fool you." Now Bertie's a fine fellow, but a Meggie? Never. He was born in Hull, for heaven's sake. The most he can ever claim is to be the father of Meggies. Incidentally, Bertie and his family lived next door to me in Albert Road for a number of years. But I just want to point out that it wasn't the music that drove us out. By the time his son Ken took up the violin, we were long gone. I've talked of the advantages of old age, but it does have its drawbacks. The obvious one being, the older you get, the more funerals you find yourself attending and the more family members and friends you lose. But I suppose the only way to safeguard yourself from that loss is to shut yourself away and care for no one, never experiencing the great joys of family, marriage, fatherhood and friendship. My wife Olga has been dead these past 18 years, but although I still feel her loss, I wouldn't have exchanged it for the 42 years we were together. My only regret is that she didn't live long enough to become Lady Moody. She deserved it for putting up with me and my temper all those years. To live a full life, you must conquer fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of pain. That wise old sage Mark Twain put it very well when he said, "Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear." We daily had to resist and master our fear during the war, but resist and master it we did, and came through, albeit with great losses. Moody's and Kelly's lost some fine men and vessels, mainly sunk by mines. The Linnet was one of the first in 1914, all hands lost. The Hellenic went down the following year, and another of the ABC fleet not long after that, the Jurassic. Only a few months previously, the crew had made it to the newspapers for picking up survivors from a Boston trawler shelled by a submarine. But no one was there to save them that day. The only trace found was the top of the bridge house, with the clock still attached. Much closer to home was the appalling Zeppelin bombing in 1916, which killed so many brave men at the Baptist church. We mourned them, but at the same time were grateful that the bombs had spared us at our family at the Knoll. By that time, young Henry had bought Yarra House and turned it into a cafe. But the army took it over as an officer's mess for the duration. That night it was filled with the dead and the dying. I believe Mrs. Ellis described it as Dante's Inferno. It is often said that a parent should not outlive their child, but war and disease have made a mockery of that sentiment. My sister Fanny's youngest Cyril saw out the war, only to die of pneumonia in 1919, and I've often felt that Harry and Annie were particularly unlucky. They lost their first child, Sarah Jane, within a year, and then their eldest son, Walker, in 1896. His death hit them, and indeed all of us, very hard. He was a bright lad. We trusted him to manage our Fleetwood operations when we started out there, and he didn't let us down. Only 28 and taken by typhoid. So much promise, such a waste. Henry died in 1909. He was taken ill when the family were at a Christmas fancy dress party and there was nothing could be done. His heart. My niece Annie was next to go. She survived until her early 50s, but the last half a dozen or so years were so blighted by the heart condition that killed her. As for my sister, I thought she was going to live forever, but she went in 1934 when she was 85. Only my nephew Henry outlived her, but he's gone now, earlier this year. It was a great loss to us all, to the company and to the town. The mayor put it very well when he said, "He was one of England's gentlemen and a great credit to Cleethorpes. In a quiet sort of way, he did a tremendous lot of good, a tremendous lot of work, and there are many people in Cleethorpes who will miss him. I know I do." I'm the only one of the 9 Moody children left now. Some of us lived to a ripe old age, but we lost Ellen and Clara relatively young, and of course poor old Fred. He died in 1915. Pneumonia took him while he was visiting his son in Stroud, although he'd not enjoyed good health for a long time. His poor wife Clara, as if it wasn't bad enough that 3 of their boys were off fighting at that time. I've been avoiding talking about my children, but I can put it off no longer. We lost our daughter Catherine in 1917. In fact, it was 22 years today. We thought we'd more cause to be worried about Alexander, her husband. He was a clever chap, a solicitor from Manchester. They lived there after they married. He joined up late in 1915, served in France with a South Irish horse, and came through it. But Kitty, she wasn't so fortunate. Acute appendicitis and peritonitis proved far deadlier than any German. She must have been in so much pain. Alexander married again a few years later, but that marriage lasted no longer than his first. He was only 51 when he died, the same age as my son George when we lost him 6 years ago. Another nasty death. Cancer in his liver and his eye, and tuberculosis in his lungs. They tried to operate on his eye, but it didn't work. He died at home at Knoll House, and I was with him. I only wish it could have been the other way round. It should have been him carrying on the name of the Moodys and Kelly, not me. I do apologise, I'm becoming quite maudlin. Yes, I have lost a son and a daughter, but I've still got my son Will and my daughter Gladys and a husband Dudley and my grandsons. That's more than some were left with after the war. I don't know why I've been allowed to live such a full life when others have not. Perhaps God is a Meggie, has kept me here these many years to fight off the evils in incorporation. Well, I won that fight, but now another one has begun. At my age, I'm not sure I've got the stomach for it. The last one was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but Chamberlain's peace for our time has proved a hollow promise. I fear this war will be far worse than the last one, and that was hard enough to bear. But that is the future, and even a visionary, such as myself, cannot foresee how it will end. Good heavens, look at the time. I'm afraid I've got to be off for my daily argument with the Cleethorpes Parliament. I must say, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. People often tell me I should write a memoir, but if I told some of the stories I'd like to tell, I'm afraid I would end up in the front of the judge again. And I'm too old to be tried for slander a second time. Now there's a story. The swearing JPs of Lincolnshire, and I was one of them. In fact, I think it's fair to say that I was declared the champion swearing JP of that day. Have I ever told you that story? No. Well, another time perhaps. I really must be going. I say, have you seen page 7? Skipper Darwood appears to have accidentally sunk a submarine with his trawler. Good man! You really should join me, you know. Look at it. Cleethorpes, our hometown. It's absolutely splendid. Now who would want to live anywhere else?
The following day, a Saturday and the anniversary of Charter Day, Sir George Moody went out in his car for an afternoon drive. On his return to Knoll House, he complained of feeling unwell and collapsed and died almost immediately after being taken to his bedroom. He was 79 years old and had lived a very full life.